Press it on.
Good afternoon. The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will come to order. The Subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the status of the Reclamation Fund and the Bureau of Reclamation's future infrastructure funding needs. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and ranking minority member, and this will allow for us to hear from witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record. If they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today, or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that Representatives Costa, Huffman, and Levin from California, Representative Fulcher from Idaho, and Representative Cheney from Wyoming be allowed to sit on the dais and participate in today's proceedings. Hearing no objection, so ordered. So now I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Good afternoon once again. Welcome to today's hearing. Today's hearing will focus on the Bureau of Reclamation's future infrastructure funding needs and the status of the Reclamation Fund. I want to thank Reclamation and our other witnesses for joining us today to talk about these important subjects. As many of you here know, the Bureau of Reclamation operates hundreds of water infrastructure projects across the American West that supply water and power to millions of people, including irrigation water for one out of every five Western farmers. Unfortunately, the average age of Reclamation's infrastructure is now more than 50 years old, and other factors such as land subsidence and climate change that were unforeseen when these projects were built contribute to growing infrastructure maintenance costs. Reclamation currently estimates that the total funding needed to address its maintenance, repair, and rehabilitation needs for just the next 5 years is approaching $3 billion. And these maintenance and repair costs are expected to grow as reclamation's infrastructure further ages. Today, I hope to hear more about these anticipated costs and examine whether Congress should use more of the receipts deposited into the so-called reclamation fund to pay for both new infrastructure and for the repair and maintenance of existing infrastructure. For those of you not familiar, the Reclamation Fund was originally established by Congress specifically to help pay for Western water infrastructure. Receipts into the fund come primarily from 1, natural resource royalties, 2, water and power sales, 3, reclamation project repayment, and 4, public land sales in Western states. Over the past 2 decades, the receipts into the Reclamation Fund have far outpaced Congress's appropriations from the fund. For the past several years, close to $1 billion in Reclamation Fund receipts have been left unappropriated each year. And these are funds not available to help fund reclamation infrastructure. And current projections show that this balance will only continue to balloon. Meanwhile, residents, farmers, and businesses continue to face water supply reliability issues in large part because of deficient and inadequate infrastructure investments. This is unacceptable. And if we add up the total unappropriated receipts, this totals over $17 billion in lost opportunities to fund critical reclamation infrastructure needs, including critical needs in my district like the Frank Kern Canal, completed in 1951, but because of subsidence issues, now has lost 60% of its water conveyance capacity. By shrinking the gap between receipts and expenditures from the Reclamation Fund, Congress could do a lot to address significant infrastructure funding issues, particularly for the farmers I represent, the more than 1 million California residents who lack access to clean stuff, who live without access to clean, safe drinking water. The Reclamation Fund was originally created by Congress as a revolving fund so that Reclamation Fund receipts could fund water projects without requiring congressional appropriations. Unfortunately, due to early solvency issues, that funding process was changed. And funding is currently left to the unpredictable whims of Congress's annual appropriations process. And I believe it's time for Congress to put forward a reliable, long-term solution for water infrastructure investment. There are some proposals out there that attempt to utilize the Reclamation Fund, such as the Save Water Resources Act, a bill that I've co-sponsored with my fellow Central Valley Representatives Josh Harder and Jim Costa. I'm also interested in incorporating what we learned from today's hearing into a bill that we're working on to address the long-term use of Reclamation Fund receipts. Once again, making the Reclamation Fund a true revolving fund or otherwise requiring appropriations to match receipts are solutions that Congress should seriously evaluate. Whatever action we take, I believe Congress must work together to figure out how to make the investments needed to ensure water supply reliability for the San Joaquin Valley, California, and the entire West. The reality is that our way of life is completely determined by our access to clean, reliable water. Infrastructure investment is a major component of ensuring that reliability in future years. And with that, I want to thank our witnesses again for being here today to help educate us on how Congress can best intervene to address these critically important issues. Thank you, and I will now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate the witnesses being here. Subcommittee meets today to discuss the Reclamation Fund and the Bureau of Reclamation's future infrastructure funding needs. The fund was created in 1902 as a way to finance and build water projects in 16 western states and territories. It wasn't until 4 years later, in 1906, that Congress saw the error of its ways and added Texas to that list of eligible states. This fund was originally conceived as a revolving fund that would finance the entire reclamation program. This idea did not live up to its promise, as the fund had difficulties maintaining its financial obligations early on. Just a short 8 years after its creation, funds fell short. Congress had to advance $20 million from the Treasury's general fund to prop up the reclamation fund. This would be over $556 million in today's dollars when adjusting for inflation. This was not the reclamation fund's only bailout. With early issues of insolvency, Congress revoked the revolving fund by passing the Reclamation Extension Act of 1914, with the requirement that all expenditures would be subject to the appropriations process. Still in need of revenues, in 1920, Congress began diverting receipts from oil and gas development on public lands to the Reclamation Fund. Today, 40% of these revenues go to the fund. Today, we have the opposite problem. The fund takes in more money than is appropriated by Congress. Some would like to use this as an opportunity to remove the Reclamation Fund from being subject to the appropriations process. This removes a layer of congressional oversight and will further hand over authority to unelected bureaucrats. It is a false narrative that the fund has a multi-billion surplus, as this money has long been spent elsewhere. And if some on the other side have their way, I expect the Reclamation Fund would be facing more funding issues in the near future. Some folks across the aisle are doing everything in their power to eliminate oil and gas development on federal lands. In this Congress, they passed legislation out of this committee that withdraws over 200,000 acres from future oil and gas development. I expect these efforts will continue. Why should this matter to Western water managers? Well, in 2018, oil and gas provided 66% of the Reclamation Fund's revenues. In contrast, revenues from the original funding sources, which was later withdrawn, only would make up 16.6% of the needed funding. The Reclamation Fund is not sustainable without the natural resource royalties. I hope you will support the development of federal lands and the revenues they provide to the Reclamation Fund with the same excitement your testimony shows you have in spending this money. It will not matter how many water infrastructure projects we discuss today if the funding will not be there to build them. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We'll now hear witness testimony. Let me remind our first witness that under committee rules, witnesses must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on, and your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I'll ask you to please complete your statement then. Now I'll introduce the administration's first witness, Mr. Grayford Payne. Mr. Payne is the Deputy Commissioner for Policy, Administration, and Budget at the Bureau of Reclamation. Thanks again for being here, Mr. Payne, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cox, Ranking Member Gohmert, and the members of the subcommittee. My name is Grayford Payne. I am the Deputy Commissioner of Policy, Administration, and Budget for the Bureau of Reclamation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Reclamation Fund and Reclamation's infrastructure needs. The subcommittee has written statements up for the record. I will use my time to provide a brief background of the Reclamation Fund, the activities funded by it, and wrap up with some foreseeable needs to addressing aging reclamation infrastructure. The Reclamation Act of 1902 established a Reclamation Fund. It was created to fund construction and maintenance of irrigation works for the storage, diversion, and development of water for irrigating lands. Deposits from the fund come from public land sales, reclamation, repayment, and water contracts, power revenues, and 40% of the onshore natural resources and mineral royalties. At the end of the fiscal year 2012, the unappropriated receipt balance remaining in the Reclamation Fund was approximately $10.8 billion. By the end of fiscal year 2018, the balance was $16.6 billion. Through annual appropriations, Reclamation's water and related resources appropriation and policy administration accounts are funded by the Reclamation Fund. In addition to these two accounts, the Reclamation Water Settlement Fund provides annually from fiscal year 2020 through 2029, $120 million of funds, if available, that would otherwise be deposited into the Reclamation Fund. I now would like to pivot to address Reclamation's infrastructure needs. Reclamation's inventory of assets include 8,000 miles of irrigation canals, 492 dams, 386 reservoirs, with a total storage capacity of 140 million acre-feet of water throughout the 17 western states. Our dams and reservoirs, water conveyance systems, and power generation facilities are integral components of the nation's infrastructure. Effectively managing our infrastructure and the benefits these structures provide is among the significant challenges facing reclamation. Approximately 50% of reclamation's dams were built between 1900 and 1950, and approximately 90% of the dams were built before adoption of currently used state-of-the-art design and construction practices. Our dam safety program has identified 363 high and significant hazard dams. This category of dams is defined as those with potential for loss of life or significant economic damage if failure occurs. Reclamation evaluates dams to address new hydraulics and seismic data or changes in state-of-the-art criteria deemed necessary for safety purposes to ensure that risks do not exceed the current reclamation public protection guidelines. For the 5-year period from 2019 to 2023, major rehabilitation and replacement needs are estimated at $3 billion. Of that amount, approximately 2.4 represents extraordinary maintenance, or what we call as XM, while $360 million is planned for dam safety modifications. There is a need for investment in new and existing infrastructure, increased water reliability through increased storage, and improved conveyance to secure our water supplies for future generations. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you and on these matters, and I will look forward to working with the committee and Congress to address any outstanding questions on the Reclamation Fund. Thank you.
I want to thank Mr. Payne for his testimony, reminding the members that under Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions, and the chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witness. I'll start by recognizing myself for the first 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Payne, thanks so much, and I'd like to start by digging just a bit into the reclamation's infrastructure funding needs that you've touched on. And I understand that much of reclamation's infrastructure is 50, 60, even 100 years old. And can you tell the committee, are reclamation's infrastructure funding needs increasing because of infrastructure near the end of its original design life?
Yes, aging infrastructure has been and is continuing as an ongoing challenge for reclamation. And as you said, because a lot of these are built in the 30s and 40s, it is reaching these levels at times. And so that's how we basically work to manage our deferred maintenance.
Right, and sorry, thanks so much. And certainly with regard to the dams, right? We talk a lot about dams, but it's so critically important that the dams are properly maintained. And what was the estimate of dam safety costs over the next decade? And from what I understand, Reclamation is currently planning for approximately $1.3 billion just in corrective actions through 2030. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. You know, that fluctuations can certainly occur that's going to change that $1.3 billion estimate. And could the funding needed to ensure the safety of the dams be significantly higher than that 1.3 through 2030?
Well, the 1.3 is just a snapshot in time, and that number could expand based on additional, every year we go out and do dam safety reviews.
All right. And so we saw a bit of that with, it wasn't a federal dam, but certainly the Oriole spillway very recently. And so the understanding from what you testified is that the Reclamation estimates that there's basically a total of $3 billion needed over the 5 years for quote, major rehabilitation and need repair, or MR&R needs. And can you tell us a bit more about those needs?
Sure. So major rehabilitation and repair is a subcomponent of our overall, well, it's our overall request for deferred maintenance. It's composed of three components. One is deferred maintenance that didn't get done in the prior year that gets rolled into a future year. Then we have deferred maintenance that is cost at $100,000 or more to either repair or replace. And then the third component is our dam safety program, where we have to do modifications to dams.
Okay. No, thanks. And obviously, there's a huge need. And more concerning, though, is that I think everybody recognizes the need and certainly cost on it, and the cost can go up and down. But as you state on page 2, and as ranking member pointed out, in 1914, Congress amended the Reclamation Acts to require all spending from the fund be subject to the annual appropriations process. And then you go on to state that which the administration believes provides proper oversight and fiscal constraint. We know that there's this ongoing maintenance need, simply for the maintenance, not to mention any future capital expenditures. And for the Bureau of Reclamation, for this maintenance to be subject to the whims of Congress, would it not be much more reliable so you could do, advanced planning, knowing that those funds are there, so the maintenance would not be deferred, or capital projects could be planned on to be able to meet future needs?
Well, every year we basically anticipate what our needs are, and I understand where you're going with, but we do a robust review every year annually to determine what our needs are when it comes to dam safety and various infrastructure needs, and we rank those based on risk. And so based on that and our budget constraints and competing programs, that's pretty much how we do it. And so Congress has the ability to provide us more money if they'd like. But right now, we use our projections from risk to determine what our needs are on an annual basis.
All right. Well, we'll touch more on that in a bit. So thank you so much. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Gohmert.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. On June 13th, my friend, colleague, Mr. McClintock, sent you questions for the record. It's been over a month, and you've not yet sent us, or we haven't received any answers. One of the questions on the Reclamation Fund, and I'll rephrase it here, was about how we hear the Reclamation Fund multi-million-dollar surplus, but the fund is subject to the appropriations process. Not all receipts are appropriated. What happens to the receipts in the Reclamation Fund that are not appropriated?
They stay in the Reclamation Fund. We have no ability, the Reclamation Fund belongs to Congress, and they have the authority to use it as they see.
So you honestly think that the money is still sitting there in the fund?
I would assume it is. I know that we get our appropriation from it.
Right. Well, let me let you know, similar to other special funds that are subject to appropriation, the Reclamation Fund is really an accounting mechanism within the larger federal budget. So if a special fund ends up taking in more receipts than it spends in a year, the surplus is added to the unified budget surplus, and then the unified budget captures all federal receipts and expenditures. So it gets spent. It just gets spent with other things that Congress has appropriated. That money doesn't end up sitting there. It'd be nice because we could sure have some great water projects completed if that were the case. Well, let me ask you, royalties on natural resources development, since it is the largest source of receipts in the Reclamation Fund, without these receipts, the fund would be facing serious funding issues. As I indicated earlier, the original sources would pay 16.6% of the needs at the current time. So the fund would be in serious funding issues, like it was when it was created. This fact does not seem to be important to some folks who are wanting to do everything in their power to eliminate oil and gas development on federal lands. But in 2018, revenues from the original funding sources for the reclamation fund would not have covered, as I said, 16.6%. So my question would be, what would be the effect on the reclamation program should this revenue source be eliminated? Talking about the oil and gas proceeds.
Well, I do know that in recent years, in the past, the power revenues that we received were the highest. That, along with the royalty, onshore royalties, were the two major receipts that provided the most inflow into the reclamation fund. Without those power revenues, I think it would be a challenge for us. But I will say that.
You think it would? I mean, since you'd only have about 83%.
Yeah. I mean,
Or you would not have 83% of what you need.
But we do receive funds from the appropriations from the general fund for specific projects that Congress authorizes. So there is one option.
What's that?
Well, I don't have it handy, but in the past, if I go back through history, all our large dams, whether it's Hoover, Glen Canyon, all those dams were appropriated through the general fund, not the reclamation fund. And currently, we can get you for the record, we have some projects that go through the general fund also.
Yeah, well, let me give you a little hint about the general fund. There's been a deal that's been cut, hadn't made it to the floor yet. It was just this week agreed upon between the president and some of the parties, but is going to end up probably leaving us with $1 trillion deficit again next year. Back in the days, in the money back at the time the Hoover Dam and some of those were built, we weren't running the equivalent of $1 trillion deficit. So we're going to be in big trouble if we don't continue to have the funds coming in there. As Chairman and you both know, water is fairly important to continuing to be able to live. So thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize Congressman Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I think the subcommittee is doing a good service for our efforts as it relates to the Bureau and reclamation projects around the country and the need to provide the support for the maintenance as well as other costs that are involved with the infrastructure. I think my previous colleague put the finger on it in terms of the monies that traditionally have been provided for this purpose and the accounting functioning that they do today, where these monies, in my view, should be going for the maintenance and for the costs of rehabilitation efforts. And because of the accounting purpose for the budget, the monies are being diverted. So I concur with my colleague in that. Although I would say, as it relates to the deficit, the agreement that's been reached that I think was a factor of other issues, and I won't talk about the $2 trillion tax deficit that has been created as a result of another measure we passed a year ago. Having said that, the revenues that come in from some of these projects, for example, the Friant water users pay for a project not out of the general fund, but as a result of a project that was authorized by Congress. A lot of these projects get paid for. Those monies go back for the original purpose for the outline construction, right?
To the best of my knowledge, it rolls back in. It depends on what the authorization says.
Right, and it's different with every different project.
Correct. We do not have a lot of organic language.
Right, but the point is that in many of these projects have been paid for, right? As a result of those mechanisms?
I would say, I don't have the facts in front of me, but I'd say that's probably a fair statement, that it's used as a revolving fund and it stays within the project use.
Well, it seems to me that, and I think there's precedent, I know you don't make the decisions, but in the sense where Contra Costa Water District paid for their facility to transfer water. The facility was turned over in terms of title and deed to the local water district. Is that not true?
I don't know the specifics on that one, but if it was a title transfer, not just a transfer work where we own, so I'm assuming you mean they took title of.
Right.
Okay, I don't have the specifics.
But there is precedent that you're aware of that.
Yeah, that's happened.
Yeah,
And
because
that's
I think
something we do try to pursue.
both Congressman Cox and I think some of our other colleagues have an interest as it relates to the Bryant-Kern Canal. I mean, what that does is allows the local water district to pay for some of the maintenance costs because they own it, they can borrow against it, and it's a much smarter way to continue to do rehab and maintenance. For the San Luis Reservoir, otherwise known as the BF-Sisk Dam in my district, there is a authorization to provide dam safety modification and other improvement. The funding, to your knowledge, is that there?
I don't know that. That's on the operational side, so
But it's been authorized, no?
I'm assuming it has been authorized.
Okay. Could not these funds that are being diverted for the purpose of covering our deficit be used for the maintenance, for earthquake safety, and possibly to enlarge the capacity of that reservoir?
If Congress so chooses to do that, I'm sure that we would then be willing to do it.
So do you make an evaluation, or is that in another department, as to how all these projects are weighted in terms of the criteria for rehabilitation and maintenance? As the chairman said, whether it be for dam safety or for other purposes for which these projects were intended?
So we work every year, we look at our deferred maintenance, whether it's modifications to dams due to safety issues, or it's a rewind of generators at some of our power plants, or new SCADA systems.
Well, you have a power plant there, you have 5 pumps in the Jones pumping plant, and I've been told that in terms of the need to update those generators, your deferred maintenance is behind the timeline. How do you prioritize those?
We normally prioritize them on a risk-based basis, and I don't have the details, but our asset management office, they work with the Technical Service Center.
My time's expired, but Mr. Chairman, it seems to me it would be important for this subcommittee to get some handle on how the maintenance and the deferral is programmed, and have a list of projects, not just in California, which interest you and I, but have a list of projects throughout the country, because clearly, we know what's kind of in our areas, in our regions, but I don't know what the sense of prioritization that you have here, and as we're looking to try to deal with scarce funding, wherever it may be, for the Bureau, we'd like to be able to weigh in and try to protect those funds.
And that's been a
certainly have to.
challenge, and we'd be willing to provide that data.
Thank you. And Mr. Fulcher from Idaho?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for allowing me to participate today. Appreciate that. Commissioner, a question for you. The 2018 Water Resource Development Act had directed the EPA to enter into agreement with Reclamation that would provide assistance in administering and servicing any of the federal credit instruments Reclamation is authorized to make available. Can you give us an update on status of that and when you think that might be complete?
I don't have a clear status on that, but I know we were directed to get with EPA and get into an agreement. And what I remember last time we talked about it, that we're in the process of working with EPA because they would be administering those grants or those loans. But I don't know the status of exactly where we are on that timeline.
Do you know of any hurdles or obstacles that has gotten in the way there?
No. On fulfilling that agreement, not to my knowledge, but we can get back to you for the record.
Commissioner, if you'd please do that, I would be very grateful.
Sure would.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll enter just a second round of questions. And back to kind of what I was talking about before, and it's very simple, is that if you could tell me, would having a dedicated long-term funding source that isn't dependent on the unpredictable whims of the annual appropriations process provide greater certainty for reclamation and water users that will be able to meet all of our infrastructure needs going forward?
You know, as both the Deputy Commissioner for Policy Administration Budget and the CFO, you know, a CFO never turns money down. And so it would add certainty, more certainty, but, you know, we base our budget and our needs. It's very challenging given our budget, you know, given our various missions and competing needs within the Bureau. And so what we put forth on an annual basis is the deferred maintenance that we feel that we need to get done and that we can actually get done with our capacity. And if Congress decides to provide more money or make it more of a defined amount or process, we'd follow whatever direction that you give us.
Sure. As somebody that's built large capital projects and certainly civil works, is that you know, deferred maintenance is a real expense, and it's something that needs to be funded and doesn't need to be deferred. Just on large projects, small projects, is I've got a little home, is you know, you put money aside or rental properties or whatever, commercial properties, you put money aside every year or every month to fix the roof, and so when the roof needs fixing, that there's money there for it, and you go about doing that. And certainly that's the case with our federal projects as well. So thanks very much, and that's all I have. Is there any other questions from members? Mr. Carlson? Well, thanks so much. That is going to conclude our first panel, and I'm going to thank Mr. Payne once again for his time and testimony, and I'll ask the witnesses for our second panel to come to the table. Thank you, Mr. Payne. I'll now introduce witnesses for a second panel. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I'm asking you to please complete your statement. I'll allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. And our first witness today is Tony Willardson, Executive Director of the Western States Water Council. Next to him is Federico Barajas, Executive Director of the San Luis and Delta Mendota Water Authority in Los Banos, California. Finally, I'm going to invite my colleague, Representative Fulcher, from the great state of Idaho, to introduce our last witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to have the privilege of introducing a fellow Idahoan, and that is Paul Arrington. He's Executive Director and General Counsel for the Idaho Water Users Association. He's also Vice Chairman of the Federal Affairs Committee, National Water Resources Association, and he's representing over 300 canal companies, irrigation districts, groundwater districts, municipal public water suppliers, and a lot of other Idahoans. Before that, among other places, he worked for the J.R. Simplot Company in Idaho. He's a fellow alum of Boise State University, law degree from Gonzaga, and I've had the opportunity to work with Paul in the past on legislation to promote aquifer recharge in Idaho, along with our U.S. Senator Risch. So we feel good about that. Paul's here to testify on the Bureau of Reclamation Infrastructure and the Reclamation Fund. So welcome, Paul, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and you both be happy to know I'm married to a very proud Vandal. All right, and so, and with that, the chair will now recognize Mr. Willardson to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cox and Ranking Member Gomert, also Representative Costa and Representative Fulcher. The council is a government entity that was created in 1965 by the governors to advise them on water policy, and our members are appointed by the governors of 18 states, the reclamation states and Alaska. Our mission is to help the governors ensure that their West has an adequate supply of water of suitable quality to meet its present and future needs. The council strongly supports the appropriation and use of receipts in the Reclamation Fund for their intended purposes. The council has also recommended that the administration and the Congress investigate the advantages of creating the Reclamation Fund as a true revolving fund, and we very much appreciate this hearing and the opportunity to testify. Today, in 1847, the first pioneers entered the Salt Lake Valley where our offices are located. Some of those were my ancestors. Brigham Young looked over the land and the lake and he said, "This is the right place." Some of those ancestors came from upstate Pennsylvania, and I'm sure they were not impressed. It didn't look like it does now. One of the first things they did was begin to plow their fields, plant crops, and diverted City Creek to irrigate those crops. Similarly, other settlers followed rivers and streams, and before long the desert began to bloom. Water then and now is still a vital resource that circumscribes our growth, our economic development, and our social and environmental quality of life. The council meets regularly, and this summer, just last week, our meetings were hosted in the state of Washington, and nearby the Columbia Basin Project irrigates over 670,000 acres of land and delivers water to over 2,000 farms, primarily apples and wheat and corn, but also dairy and beef production, with an annual cash value of about $630 million. Congress originally authorized over 1 million acres of irrigation in the basin, and that included construction of an East High Canal. The Department of Ecology began issuing permits in that area overlying the Odessa Aquifer in the 1970s for groundwater for irrigation in anticipation that the project would be completed. It's been indefinitely deferred, and that has left a critical groundwater overdraft that threatens not only crops, but also commercial, municipal, and industrial uses in that area. Working with Reclamation, the Washington Department of Ecology is actually, through conservation and some project reoperations, been able to provide water to 90,000 acres in that area, but there's more that needs to be done. Obviously, if there was money in the Reclamation Fund, the East High Canal could be completed and bring water to that critically short area. There are many similar examples across the West, and early on, as has already been pointed out, the Reclamation Fund was not sufficient to build some of the major projects like Grand Coulee or Hoover or Glen Canyon, and those tapped general funds and are being repaid with water and power sales. They are not funded from the Reclamation Fund. I actually wrote for the council a report in 1987 looking at some of the funding mechanisms. And it was clear at that time that with declining expenditures for reclamation purposes and increasing receipts, primarily from mineral leasing, that at some point there would be sufficient revenues to fund all of Reclamation's activities. The Reclamation receipts, actual receipts in 2017 were $1.1 billion. In 2018, $1.2 billion, and estimated receipts for 2019 were $2.8 billion, obviously with greater mineral leasing. And estimated receipts for 2020 are $2.3 billion. The administration's request for the reclamation program has been consistent over time at around $1 billion. It's $1.1 billion for 2020. Obviously, that's led to an unobligated balance, which is estimated in 2019 to be $18.6 billion, and in 2020 to be over $20 billion. These unobligated balances, as has been pointed out, actually have been spent elsewhere, and essentially reduce the need for Congress to borrow more money. Congress, in the legislation that has been passed, had dedicated 10% of receipts to the Reclamation Fund to the Treasury, but obviously much more than that has been spent. The Council strongly supports appropriate federal investment in water-related infrastructure projects and programs that provide jobs and economic security while protecting the environment. The federal government has a significant role to play here, and Congress should seriously consider the advantage of converting the Reclamation Fund to a special and true revolving fund. I appreciate the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize Mr. Barajas.
Good afternoon, Chairman Cox, Ranking Member Gombert, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Federico Barajas, and on behalf of the San Luis and Delta Mendoza Water Authority, I thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony on a matter of critical importance to our member agencies and the communities they serve. Ensuring the reliability of water supplies to Western water users and the role of the Federal Reclamation Fund to accomplish this purpose. The San Luis and Delta Mendoza Water Authority was formed in 1992 as a California Joint Powers Authority comprised of 28 public agencies that serve water to approximately 1.2 million acres of highly productive farmland in California's Central Valley, over 2 million people in California's Silicon Valley, and over 200,000 acres of managed wetlands within the Pacific Flyway. In addition to representing our member agencies on areas of common interest, the authority operates and maintains a number of critical Central Valley Project water conveyance facilities under an agreement with the Bureau of Reclamation, including the Jones Pumping Plant, the Delta Mendoza Canal, the O'Neill Pumping Plant, and the Intertie. CBP operations have changed significantly since the 1980s. Under today's operating guidelines, water allocations to the Central Valley Project South of Delta Ag average about 45% of contract amounts and 75% to the M&I water contracts. Water supply shortages not only impact water deliveries to our member agencies, but as evidenced during the recent drought, water supply shortages also cause severe water quality problems, especially for disadvantaged communities that rely on groundwater. Land subsidence has been a persistent problem in the San Joaquin Valley, and is exacerbated during drought periods such as the one we had in 2012 through 2016, when reductions in surface supply led to an increased reliance on groundwater, thereby inducing rapid subsidence in several areas in the valley. This subsidence lowered the elevation of regional water conveyance facilities, including the Fry and Kern Canal and the Delta Mendoza Canal, causing reduced conveyance capacity. In the case of the Fry and Kern Canal, capacity of the canal through the most subsided area is estimated to be about 40% of design capacity. In the case of the Delta Mendoza Canal, capacity has been reduced by an estimated 10 to 15% of design capacity. Water is the lifeblood of our nation. Without reliable water, every sector of our economy would suffer. Food cannot be grown, businesses cannot operate, and homes and schools cannot be built or operate without water. Critical water infrastructure must be maintained and modernized to ensure the delivery and safety of water today and for future generations. Water infrastructure is perhaps the most important form of infrastructure in our nation, yet is often overlooked. An investment in the water infrastructure is an investment in the very foundation of our nation's economy, its health, and its future. Many of the Bureau of Reclamation facilities are over 50 years old. Reclamation has an infrastructure and maintenance backlog of approximately $3 billion. We have an aging infrastructure reaching the end of design life, like the Jones Pumping Plant in our service area. Additional projects will need to be constructed to minimize impacts to the regional economies. These projects include increasing conveyance of surface water by expanding the conveyance capacity of the Delta Mendoza Canal, the Fry and Kern Canal, and other major water facilities. Increasing surface and subsurface water storage by expanding the San Luis Reservoir, constructing Pacheco Reservoir, and other regional projects to hold water during high water years to be used in years of drought. These are major investments, and the next generation of water infrastructure projects require new, innovative ways of incentivizing local, state, and federal partnerships. Using the Reclamation Fund to increase water infrastructure investment would protect our existing facilities in the most productive food supply system in the world, generate regional economic development, and provide increased opportunities for future generations to experience the American dream. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barajas. The chair now recognizes Mr. Arrington to testify for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cox, Ranking Member Gomert, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to talk about this issue of what I view as utmost importance. I really appreciated the comments, particularly yours, Chairman Cox, in the introduction, talking about the need to find solutions to address existing infrastructure needs as well as new infrastructure needs, and how, as we look at the Reclamation Fund, when you consider the fact that receipts have exceeded expenditures over the years, we've had approximately $17 billion in lost opportunities to address some of our aging infrastructure needs. And where we find ourselves now, as you've heard multiple times today, is in a scenario where over the next 5 years, aging infrastructure needs for reclamation facilities are in excess of $3 billion to be addressed. And it's something that, to echo, I think, again, what you said, as Congress, if it works together, can come to find a solution. There's lots of reasons why we can say, no, it won't work, or why we can fail in finding a solution to this problem. But there are many more reasons why this can be successful, because, as you said, water is a way of life. Our way of life is tied to the access of water. I remember as a kid, I used to drive throughout our communities all the time, and even as a kid, I was amazed as I looked out at the canals and the reservoirs and the infrastructure that dots the land in Idaho. I did not grow up on a farm. I was not a farmer. In fact, as a child, my goal was to have a job where I showered before I went to work. And I was amazed, though, at the foresight and the ingenuity of those who went before us, who created a legacy of water development that has provided so much benefit and continues to provide so much benefit to our communities and to our nation. But it is getting old. In the Pacific Northwest region, where Idaho is at, the average age of the dams is 80 years. And the average age of infrastructure generally, that's dams, pipelines, canals, etc., is 78 years old. It's old, and it is in need of repair. Every year we sit with our local reclamation offices, and they give us a list of the things that need done. This year, American Falls Dam needs approximately $7 million for spillway and apron repairs. Palisades Dam in the next coming years has maintenance buildings and other building construction dealing with some of their projects at over $4 million. We have spillway repairs on Ryrie Dam estimated to be $12 to $15 million. These are very real numbers that water users, stakeholders, have to share in those costs. And importantly, they share in the non-federal portion of those costs, but then they also have to turn around and make sure that their facilities are upkept and their facilities are operated. So finding a solution that allows for easier access or more readable access to funds to help address these infrastructure needs is very important. I believe, as I said in my written testimony, we're at a similar crossroads today as our forefathers and mothers were when they looked out across the desert and built this infrastructure. We, as we sit here today, we look 10, 20, 30 years into the future. What are our needs in both existing and new infrastructure that can be addressed now? Finding ways to utilize the Reclamation Fund to address these needs will help alleviate that, help us create a new legacy and strengthen that legacy for future generations. The Congress has used the Reclamation Fund to address and proposed to use the Reclamation Fund to address needs, we'll say. For example, about 10 years ago, Congress provided Reclamation the authority to access the Reclamation Fund without further appropriation to pay for tribal water rights settlement commencing in 2020. Recently, H.R. 1904 was introduced to permanently extend that. Similarly, the bill you referenced earlier, the Save Water Resources Act, proposes to use $300 million of revenues that would otherwise go into the reclamation fund for water infrastructure needs. Dedicated funding from the reclamation fund is a tool that could be added and should be added to the water infrastructure toolbox. We believe that legislation similar to these bills should be enacted to allow reclamation to access funds for much needed infrastructure projects. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to work, for your work and for the opportunity to testify today. We stand ready to assist in any way we can and be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Arrington. Before moving to questions, I ask unanimous consent to submit written testimony from the Friant Water Authority for the record. Friant is a public agency in California that manages the Friant Current Canal, a component of the federal Central Valley Project. I thank the authority for their interest in our hearing today. Reminding members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chairman will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'll start by recognizing myself for the first 5 minutes of questions. And Mr. Willardson, thanks so much. I want to thank you again the Western States Water Council. And the council has advocated for more than a decade for Congress to fully utilize the reclamation fund. And just simply, can you describe some of the water infrastructure needs in the Western states and how full funding from the reclamation fund could help pay for these needs?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, if there was more money in the reclamation fund, just looking at reclamation's current budget, there would be a number of opportunities. Obviously, in California's Central Valley, also on endangered species recovery programs, addressing invasive species threats, greater investment in the Klamath Basin, as well as the Middle Rio Grande, and as already been mentioned, some of the tribal settlements. There are pending settlements now in the Navajo Utah and also the Navajo Hopi. And one of the other areas in particular that the council's been active is with rural water projects. There are a number of those that have been authorized in Montana, New Mexico, North and South Dakota that have not been funded adequately to complete the projects. Completion would benefit many rural communities, and it would also save money given the increasing construction costs. I believe some of the estimates are that at the current rate is current schedule, it could take $11 billion to finish those projects. Senator Barrasso, I believe, had entertained legislation which would dedicate $80 million from the reclamation fund, and the result would be those projects would be finished in a timely manner at a cost closer to $4 billion. So there is a cost of delay.
Thanks so much. And certainly, Mr. Barajas, I'd certainly like to hear, I recently toured the Friant Current Canal, and I brought Chairman Grijalva there to show him how serious the situation was, and we saw how the land subsidence had reduced the ability of this conveyance system to deliver water supplies down from, it's only flowing at 40% of its rated original design capacity, which really cut short the amount of water that can be delivered for the rural communities and certainly the ag industry. And can you just describe some of the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority's infrastructure needs?
Yes,
more
thank you.
color on that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the question. The authority and its member agencies have a number of infrastructure needs, both currently and into the future. Specifically, near-term needs that we have include the Delta Mendota Canal, and right now you're aware of the rehab at the Jones Pumping Plant that we're undertaking right now. That is a rehab effort for the 6 units that play a key role in water deliveries south of Delta. We have taken it upon ourselves to initiate the rehab that is required on that, over $30 million that are going to be required at the end of the day for those. So that's the near term. When you look at the long term, we have the Delta Mendota Canal subsidence issue and all the shortcomings associated with that. 10 to 15% reduction as a result of subsidence, and we need to have major investments associated with repairs with that Delta Mendota Canal. In addition to that, we have storage, both surface and groundwater storage projects The expansion of San Luis Reservoir, which I mentioned earlier, is a major capital investment and infrastructure investment that is going to be critical for us for a sustainable future.
Right. And obviously, reliable, we've all talked about reliable water delivery and how important it is, particularly in California. For the million Californians who don't have access to clean, fresh drinking water. And I know that reclamation is often thought of as serving agricultural users, but I know your agency provides water to, 31 million people each year. And can you speak to how the reclamation water that San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority distributes and makes its way to cities and homes?
Yes, the authority delivers water to Valley Water in the Silicon Valley, from water that is pumped, a Jones pumping plant, and then transported and conveyed through the Delta Mendota Canal to the San Luis Reservoir, and ultimately through the Pacheco Tunnel. And so we make water available to the cities and the Silicon community by those means. In addition to that, the authority delivers water to the city of Tracy, which is about 100,000 people in population. And then off the Delta Mendota Canal, and we actually help and assist deliveries to disadvantaged communities in the Central Valley, cities like Coalinga, Avenal, and Huron off the San Luis Canal.
Thanks. All cities I represent. So thank you so much, Mr. Barajas. And the chair now recognizes Ranking Member Gomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate all your testimony. Mr. Willardson, your testimony mentions converting the reclamation fund from a special treasury account to a true revolving trust account or fund with annual receipts appropriated for authorized purposes in the year following their deposit. Can you give us some examples of other revolving trust funds, how they work out?
Well, I think one example would be the Highway Trust Fund. And for many years, expenditures were not equal to the receipts. Congress changed that. I think similarly, the Inland Waterways Trust Fund now, that is an issue where in both cases, through fuel taxes, the beneficiaries pay. And the Inland Waterways Trust Fund has not similarly been expended as it was. So there are examples where Congress has turned these into funds that are without appropriation. I would also point out that with the Bonneville Power Administration, that Congress has allowed receipts to be used for maintenance, similarly in the Colorado River Basin, with both the Upper and Colorado River and the Colorado River Dam funds. Those monies are expended without further appropriation for authorized purposes.
Well, along the line, again, of the revolving trust fund, do you have any idea how that would work within the requirements of Section 16 of the Reclamation Extension Act of 1914?
I'm not that familiar with that act.
You don't have
Obviously,
that act from 1914 just right there ready
I've been with the council 40 years, but that's even before my time. Obviously, with the new, requiring appropriations as Congress has, Congress would still have oversight in authorizing the projects which would be eligible for funding. You make a good point. In the last couple of years, receipts have nearly doubled. And that was not something I don't think that we anticipated at some point, that we would see that kind of mineral leasing.
I don't think any of us anticipated it.
No, it has been a boon economically with fracking and other technologies. Also, has been pointed out, many of these projects are repaid through power receipts and from irrigation to the extent that they're able to pay.
Well, good. And got a question for Mr. Barajas and Mr. Arrington. And by the way, Mr. Barajas, I don't meet a lot of people named Barajas, but I had a good friend in Baylor Law School named Dick Barajas, Richard Barajas, and he and I were chief justices of appellate courts at the same time. I know that's Texas and that's not where you are, but if there's any distant family there, he'd be a relative worth getting to know. But I wanted to ask you, following up, Mr. Costa's back, because I wanted to follow up on something that he brought up, that how nice it would be, because I know we haven't seen a list of where the priorities are for the reclamation fund. Have you seen a list at any time of the projects either in your state or in all of the western states that are being funded by the reclamation fund?
I personally have not.
Yeah. Ms. Arrington?
I have not seen it either. I do know in talking with our local reclamation, though I haven't seen a list or anything, I know that they are constantly looking at the facilities within our area in southern Idaho and analyzing what's going on, analyzing those needs, and kind of prioritizing when they get to what project based on the funds they have, the ability of the stakeholders to help pay, and that's an ongoing analysis that they do on these projects.
I understand that's an ongoing analysis. They do.
They do, but I haven't.
But
No, I haven't seen.
I think where Mr. Costa was going, it'd be nice if we knew what their ongoing analyses were, where their priorities were. Are they putting too much in one area? You know, Ms. Williamson, have you ever seen the list of their projects at any given time?
I do know that they have a strategic plan. I think it's a 5-year plan that runs
Yeah,
through
but my question
2020.
is, have you ever seen it?
Last year, some of my testimony includes some figures that were included in a stakeholder conference with the budget in 2018. I have not seen the plan recently, and I've not seen a list of project priorities.
Yeah. So anyway, I just would agree with my friend from California. I think that would be a worthy goal for this committee. And I yield back. My time's expired.
Thank you. Chair, and I recognize Representative Costa from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And to follow up on Congressman Gomart's questioning, I mean, I think the reason that's important is because we know that there's a lot of need out there, and we really want to try to get a handle on what the efforts are to whether it's projects in the San Luis Water Agency or the Delta Mendota or the Friant water agencies. And there's a lot of demands out there, but we're trying to get a handle on, and it gets back to this this potential of the funding and a revolving fund, because if we're going to be able to try to figure out how this subcommittee tries to develop some priorities, we need to know what the thinking is within the department to get our arms around it. I mean, if the need is $5 billion plus and we can only look in the next 5 years of $3 billion or less, how do we get from here to there, and how do we figure out ways? I mean, a revolving fund, I think, could be a good idea. Mr. Is it Willerson? And have you given some thought to how we could leverage that?
I think there are a number of opportunities.
I mean, I think that's something the subcommittee would be interested in knowing, and how, if we could set aside that this part of funding that's going to account for paying off our deficit, which is, I think, somewhat misleading to say the least, and then actually use that to then, and then for water districts that have their own local sources of revenue, a lot of these projects work with multiple sources of revenue, local, state, federal, and then you couple that with a revolving fund, then you're getting more bang for the buck. And if we can use this series of funding and say, look at this committee's decided that we don't longer want to put that money for accounting purposes, but we want that money to go into an account, a revolving fund that will continue to build. And then for local regions that have skin in the game, you can leverage this. It just seems to me to make a lot more sense if we thought about it in those terms. Let me, Mr. Baraha, you and I have worked together over the years. You actually have the benefit of wearing multiple hats. You've worked on the other side. I'm glad that in your answer to the question to the chairman, Congressman Cox, you listed the priorities of the San Luis water efforts. And I mentioned the San Luis Reservoir and the BF6 Dam for retrofit. You also mentioned the Delta Mendota Canal that is suffering the same issues as the Friant Kern Canal with subsidence and its ability to provide water. How would your current look at, and you represent not only agricultural, and the agricultural water you provide puts food on America's dinner table every night, and that should always be underlined, because that is food in America is a national security issue, I believe, and we forget that too often. But it is, and that's why that water is so essential for your ability to deliver to the farms that Congressman Cox and I represent, the water to grow those commodities, to make that food a reality for Americans and for export purposes. We have another thing, Mr. Gomart, that you're not familiar with, and it's somewhat, it's very important. It's difficult, but we're trying to get in balance our overdraft. We have groundwater and we have surface water, but we've been taking our groundwater for years, and we're not putting it back. And so that's like going to the bank and making withdrawals. You can only do that for so long. SGMA is an important piece of state legislation that a water district like yours, Mr. Baraha, is trying to comply with over a time period. How could this funding be important with your priorities in your water agency to fund these projects to comply with this important state law?
So one of the things that we're doing as an authority in representing our member interests is actually—
And you also represent a large urban constituency as well.
We sure do. We're actually assisting with the groundwater sustainability agencies that are required under SGMA. And one of the things we're doing is there are some groundwater sustainability plans that are due January 2020. And one of the things we're doing is we're actually right now putting together those plans and assisting our member agencies to ensure that there's going to be a plan ahead of those deadlines and to be able to assist with different grant opportunities that are going to be required. The additional funding would be available, and we would be instrumental in helping and advising our member agencies in groundwater overdrafting issues that need to be addressed now, given the deadlines that lie ahead under the state law.
And my time has expired, but Mr. Chairman, I don't know if Mr. Baraha noted when he spoke on his comments, but not only do you provide water for farms, but all of Santa Clara Water Agency is in your district, right?
That's correct.
For people who aren't familiar with the geography of California, that's all of Silicon Valley. And how much population is in Silicon Valley at your service area approximately?
So we look at 1.2 million people, basically, over 2 million people.
People in the heart, one of the hearts of America's high-tech industry.
Yes.
You provide water for.
Yes, sir.
No small deal.
Not at
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Well, we will move to a second round of questions, and I did just want to touch more about that, is that first, SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is something that is facing the Central Valley, a huge issue and a pretty tall task. And the infrastructure for the surface water is essential for the groundwater storage and recharge. And can you just talk a bit more about how the funding needs and efforts in the Central Valley could reach sustainability for SGMA and how the reclamation funding is going to help in that regard?
Yes. So one of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, that are required under the state law is to have groundwater sustainability plans by January of 2020 and a full compliance by 2040. So the state of California has designated nearly every groundwater basin in the San Joaquin Valley as a critically overdraft or high priority, underscoring the significance of SGMA implementation to future of the people that live in the valley and that operate within the valley. That's a pretty tall order to be able to really address those issues throughout the San Joaquin Valley. And we're trying to do everything we can proactively to make sure that those groundwater sustainability plans are in place based on those deadlines. That's going to carry a lot of investment and infrastructure requirements to be able to address that. One of the things we're doing is we're basically providing staff, FTE resources right now to be able to help our member agencies stay ahead of that. And so one of the things that we're anticipating is that there's going to be major dollars and major infrastructure investments to be able to address that overdraft issue from just a state requirement. And so we're trying to get on top of that.
Oh, great, thanks. And And I had a question actually for the commissioners, which I didn't have an opportunity to ask, but have you looked at any potential liability if there was a dam failure? And what that would cost the agency for potential any loss of life or property? Because you see this deferred maintenance, and it occurs in things, like the Oroville Dam, which, they put that off, and now it costs $1 billion to fix. But what would happen if there were, in fact, a dam failure, right? And the liability, which would be billions and billions. In fact, it would probably top the balance of the reclamation fund.
Yeah, there's certainly a major risk associated with that. I don't have a specific figure as it relates to the BFCISC or the San Luis Reservoir. Obviously, reclamation would be the more appropriate agency to respond to that, but I can assure you that that's why we want to be able to capitalize on the opportunity the reclamation has to implement the Safety of Dams project. Based on the schedule that I've seen so far, reclamation is scheduled to basically initiate the Safety of Dams program next year, to be able to address precisely the issue that you're highlighting, to avoid any significant catastrophe within the vicinity of that reservoir specifically. So we're looking at not only preventing that from happening, but also on top of that Safety of Dams effort that they're initiating next year, we want to be able to further solidify the opportunity for water supply sustainability on top of that safety component.
Great, thanks so much. And Mr. Arrington, you're here on behalf of the Natural Water Resources Association, and I know that you've got a sense of the infrastructure needs across the West. And from what your testimony was before, I believe that the Natural Water Resources Agency supports the idea of utilizing a reclamation fund to pay for Western infrastructure. And if you can just provide us some color on the needs that you see and how the reclamation fund could help accomplish those goals.
Absolutely. So I did talk about some of that in my written testimony as well, oral testimony. And I put some information about needs in some of the western states. Arizona, I mentioned California a little bit, though Mr. Barajas is much more qualified than I on that, Colorado and some others. I'll speak a little more detail to Idaho and some of the needs we have. You look at the Treasure Valley, that's the capital city of Boise, is the largest urban area in Idaho. It sits at the base of the Boise River drainage, about 4 million acre feet annual flow with 1 million acre feet of storage. So it's a feat to not only help control those floods, but also then to provide the water for irrigation throughout the season in the valley below. Estimated about 160,000 acre feet will be needed in addition to what we have just to supply the growing demand and need of water. We have that same kind of issue throughout the state, where if you look at growing demand and growing needs, new storage, new opportunities to enhance and augment and make a more reliable water supply, including groundwater recharge and other things. Having revolving loan programs or grant programs or things like that to help shore up existing infrastructure, but then also provide opportunities for new infrastructure to meet those needs, using the Reclamation Fund to provide a sure funding source, I guess, for those kinds of programs would be a real help.
Well, thanks so much. We have impending votes, and so I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony, and certainly the members very previously for their question. And it was mentioned earlier today, the Reclamation Fund was originally a revolving fund until running into these solvency issues 100 years ago or so. But however, we have an entirely different situation where today, where the appropriations from the fund are severely lagging behind the receipts. And we certainly have learned today that we have significant infrastructure needs that are not being met. As Mr. Costa had asked, and Mr. Gomert had remarked on, I think it would be a great idea for the committee as a whole to address a letter to the Bureau of Reclamation regarding these priority needs, and we can work with the witnesses here to maybe help us draft that letter and some of the points that we want to hit on there. But from what I've heard today, I'm optimistic that this is something that we can get bipartisan support on. to reach a solution for better utilizing the reclamation fund to address these critical water resource infrastructure needs. And so, very hopeful about that. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, with that objection, the committee stands adjourned.